Well, welcome back to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to continue on with our SNAP review, EBT, food stamps. Because of the government shutdown, people are crying and whining and up in arms and even threatening looting and stealing in stores if they don't get their SNAP benefits. 42 million people in the United States, 1 out of every 8 persons in this country is receiving government food assistance, free government food, free handout. 1 out of 8 people in this country. We're supposed to be a prosperous nation. We're supposed to be home of the brave, land of the free. We're supposed to be that city on a hill, and people from all over the world look to us for leadership. We're supposed to be prosperous and blessed of God, and 42 million people in our country are getting free government food. There is something wrong with a nation that has to feed 1 out of every 8 people in the nation. That 1 out of 8 people have to receive government food. Well, they don't have to receive it. They're getting it. And that is the problem. So we're going to look further at this problem that we've been dealing with now for a few weeks and hopefully make sense of it, because a lot of Christians are confused. They're hearing the newspapers and the liberal media. They're trying to spin this as a crisis. They're trying to actually promote socialism. They've been doing that for decades now. And the Democratic liberal left wants to further socialism. They want everyone to become dependent on the government. They want a huge, big government. They want an idol sitting in Washington as if it's God, G-O-D. They want G-O-V, government, to be G-O-D, and they want to build a secular, humanistic utopia around big government. And this is one of the ways they do it. They get everyone dependent on government, and then government can do whatever they want and control the masses, because everyone has to turn to the government to have food, in this case. So let's read further in the Detroit News. I'm reading from the Detroit News again. They seem to be covering this pretty well. Not unbiased, I would add, but they seem to be covering it. Michigan SNAP recipients to get half monthly allotment for November. Some benefits begin this weekend. So what has happened is you had a number of judges, liberal, leftist, Democratic judges, imposing a leftist socialist agenda on the administration and saying, you have to release these funds. We court order you to release these funds, trying to boss the president around. And it looks like the administration is going to release half of the funds, because that's all they have to release. They have a fund for SNAP, and because the government is shut down, because there is a stalemate in Washington between the Democrats and Republicans, they have half of the amount of money needed to fund SNAP for a month. And so they're going to release that half of the amount that they have, and that will supply half of the amount for these 42 million people. So they won't get their full benefit, they'll get half of it. Okay, it says some 1.4 Michigan's residents who receive federal assistance to pay for food. Assistance, there it is. That is the way people should be looking at this. This is an assistance. So if you cannot, as a last resort, feed yourself or your family, then you can turn to the government and see if you're qualified to receive federal assistance. This is not supposed to be the main way you feed yourself, even in an emergency. So people forget that. SNAP is Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. So instead of seeing it as your total food source, this is supposed to be just a way to cover, say, the end of the month or whatever. That is not what it is today. Today, it is the main food source for millions and millions of families. That is not the way it's supposed to be. Pay for about half of their normal benefits for the month of November beginning Saturday, state officials announced Wednesday. We understand and share the disappointment many households feel about receiving only a portion of their November SNAP benefits. First of all, it's an assistant program. So this is for people who are at wit's end. They don't have any other means to provide for themselves, whether it's some kind of financial emergency or some tragedy, health problem, and they've had to divert all of their resources to some critical emergency. And so they turn to the government to assist them, and not to grow dependent on the government, not to grow needy of the government so that every month they're counting on this or else they'll starve. And that never would have happened anyway if none of these families had received a penny for November. They wouldn't have starved, because there are all kinds of checks in our system, our food pantries, and we have churches, and family can chip in. And the way people used to do this for, well, going back thousands of years, people have always had to pool their resources together during emergencies. The problem is it's not an emergency for most of these families on SNAP and individuals. It's actually just their dependency, and they've grown used to that. And so they spend their money on other things. They'll go out and buy an iPhone. And a lot of these YouTube and TikTok videos are people complaining about their SNAP being cut while they're recording themselves on the latest iPhones. This is showing bad financial management, not so much starvation. These benefits are a vital lifeline for many Michigan families, especially with the rising cost of food. Again, as adults, you're supposed to be able to figure these things out for yourself and not turn to the government to help solve all of your problems. So adults, in the old days, they would figure out how they can feed themselves and feed their families, and they would do it. They would make it happen. And today, we're raising infants for adults. We're perpetuating childhood for a lot of these people. They don't know how to make a living for themselves. They don't know how to feed themselves. They don't know how to do anything for themselves. And this is not the way the Bible teaches that families should be. The Bible teaches that, for example, men should not be dependent on other people and not be idle. They should go out and work with their hands, it says in the New Testament, so that they have enough to provide for their families. And also there are warnings that if you don't provide for your family as a man, you are less than an infidel, or you're less than an unbeliever. You're not doing right if you don't provide for your family. And yet, a lot of these people on food stamps don't even have a man in the house. And they're mostly single mothers raising babies on their own. Now, why? Why are they raising babies on their own? Again, because they acted foolishly in their youth, and they didn't insist on marrying the man who would bear them, or who would produce children, the father of their children. So they played fast and loose. They were immoral, fornicators, had sex, casual sex, bought into the feminist ideology that they could do whatever they want with their bodies. These are the kind of people who party and go out and drink and carouse and get pregnant and not think about the future. They don't think about responsibilities, and then they turn to the government and say, well, I have babies to feed. Why do you have babies to feed and you don't have a husband in the house? Why do you have babies to feed and you don't have a man providing for you and your children? Why? Because of their choices of foolishness in their youth. And there's no way around that. But you can't talk about that because we're in a secular society and we're being told that there are no moral values. We're told that you can do whatever you want, do what you feel. But there are consequences to living outside of God's will, and one of them is that you won't have the resources you need when you need them, because if you're a woman and you get pregnant and you have 3 or 4 babies from different fathers and none of them are around and not providing, you are really in trouble. And I feel for a lot of these single women that are raising children. Yeah, right now they are in trouble because they are heavily dependent on the welfare system of this nation, and they actually got pregnant and played fast and loose because of the welfare system safety net that was available for them. They knew that if they got pregnant, that the government would pay for their food. They knew that if they got pregnant and had children, that the government would pay for their housing in Section 8. They knew that they could count on the government stepping in and being their husband, essentially, provider of the family. And so they didn't worry about getting pregnant and not having a husband. And so then when the SNAP benefits get cut or delayed, like it is in November here, they are up in arms and it's a crisis. Yeah, it's a crisis. And I feel bad that it is a crisis, but it's because of the foolishness of their younger days, where they didn't follow the wisdom of God. They didn't follow just simply looking ahead and saying, no, wait a minute. For thousands and thousands of years, women have always insisted on the men that they have sex with marrying, and then there's a man in the home to go out and earn the resources and feed the family and bring home the money to make a living and provide for the children. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way the Bible teaches it is supposed to be. There's a whole model of family and marriage in the Bible. And in the Western world, we have followed that for most of Western history, except now in the latter days of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, people are beginning to grow used to and comfortable with and dependent on a socialist kind of mentality where the government will give you whatever you need. And so that destroys the whole family. And you can chart it on a graph from the 1960s onward, how the family has been destroyed by these welfare programs that incentivize women to get pregnant out of wedlock, to not even bother having a husband and provider, and just turning to the government to provide. Well, what happens is there is some delay or cut in their benefits, and all of a sudden they're in a crisis mode. Well, yeah, they are in a crisis mode, but they should have thought ahead of things, and they should have followed the wisdom of God instead of doing their own thing and doing what they felt like. And now they're paying the price. So we'll see what happens in the days ahead. It says the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which oversees the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, initially planned to freeze payments starting November 1st due to the federal government shutdown, the Associated Press reported. But federal officials said Monday the program would be partially funded for November after 2 judges issued rulings requiring the government to keep the program running. So they have a fund for SNAP. The government is shut down, so they don't have any authority to pay any more funds, but they did have some in a fund that would pay half of the benefit. So they're releasing that partial benefit funding in November. MDHHS said it was notified Tuesday by USDA that maximum allotment would be reduced to approximately 50% of SNAP recipients' payments for November. According to the state agency, recipients who normally get their benefits on the 3rd, 5th, and 7th of the month will receive their partial SNAP allotment Saturday. All other SNAP recipients will get their partial benefits on their normally scheduled date. MDHHS said new applications for SNAP benefits filed in October and November still will be processed, but it is unclear whether those applicants will receive any benefits for November. Funding for the partial November benefits will come from SNAP contingency funds. See, there's that emergency fund, officials said, which will cover about half of the billion nationwide cost of the program. SNAP serves about 1 in 8 Americans, and that is a terrible statistic. 1 in 8 Americans, home of the free, including about 1.4 Michiganians. In Michigan, the average household assistant by the program receives about $335 in benefits per month. Wow. That, to me, that doesn't sound like an assistant program. That sounds like a full benefit program where that pays all of your groceries for the month. $335 or about $5.68 per person per day. So that's a lot. That's a lot, especially for kids. $5.68 per day. SNAP benefits support more than 492,000 Michigan children. Yeah, that's the problem. We have the single mother household, primarily, looking to SNAP to provide all their food money. And this is a problem. I spoke in the last video of a woman in Detroit who said, I have children, I have to feed them. And I understand that a mother, her instinct is to do whatever it takes to feed her children. And I feel bad for all of these women who are trying to raise children and looking to the government for food, free food every month. And if that free food goes away, they are in trouble because they don't have a man in the house to earn the money. And it's very hard for them to work full-time and also raise children, especially, over 1 or 2 children. If you have 3 or 4 kids, sometimes 5 or 6 in some of these inner city families, then you are really in trouble because you're not going to pay for daycare for 5 or 6 kids or even 3 or 4 kids. That's just way too expensive. So you can't afford to pay someone to watch your kids while you go to work, because the money you earn at work will probably not even cover the daycare for your children. So they're stuck. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. They have to stay home and raise their own children, which is always the best policy. And that's the way the Bible outlines that women are to be keepers of the home and raising children. That is their unique calling, in fact. So it's good and right for these women to be fighting for their children to find food. What isn't good and right is the circumstances around why they are in the situation they're in. And the reason why most of them are in that situation is because they don't have a man in the house. And the reason they don't have a man in the house is because they never bothered to get married, usually, to begin with. So they bought into the 60s sexual revolution. They played fast and loose with morality. They slept around and didn't follow God's plan for sexuality, and they never consequently got married. And they therefore don't have a man to go out while they raise the children, go out and earn the living and bring home the money and buy the food and support the family and the marriage. They don't have that. So they're really caught between a rock and a hard place, and they do need help, but we need to stop enabling and supporting and encouraging that dysfunctional system. We need to tell women that, no, we will not pay for the raising of your children just because you didn't want to go out and get a husband. And it also enables this dysfunctional idea where women can divorce their husband because of all of these petty psychological reasons, like they're not fulfilled, they want to pursue a career and do all these other things while they have children. And so they've essentially walked away from a provider, walked away from resources to buy food. And so they have to turn to the government for SNAP benefits as their sole source of food. And again, the circumstances of their situation were caused by sin and rebellion against the will of God and foolish choices that they made. And they need to realize that they are the cause of the situation that they're in right now. And unfortunately, a lot of times in the inner city, a lot of the generational poverty is caused by generational dependency on the government welfare programs. So dysfunctional, broken families of women raising kids on welfare produces more of the same thing. And the women who are on welfare, they produce babies, they raise the kids in that welfare dependency situation, and therefore then their children, when they get adulthood, they're thinking in terms of welfare mentality themselves. And so the women get pregnant out of wedlock, the young women, they perpetuate that welfare dependency generation after generation after generation. And that needs to be addressed, and that needs to be stopped. We need to stop generating welfare dependency. And this whole SNAP problem that we have in November because of the government shutdown, that is a symptom of a sickness that needs to be addressed. Now, Christians sometimes are very confused because they say, well, we're supposed to be compassionate and helpful and loving to people. So if they're hungry, we need to feed them, right? Well, generally speaking, yes, but when you get specifically into the details, the Bible also talks if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. So the Bible also teaches that if a man is hungry and he's able-bodied, and he's just not working because he doesn't want to work, or he wants to pursue a hobby, or he wants to goof off and hang out, and he wants to act like he's independently wealthy or whatever reason, if he doesn't work and if he's not earning a living, the Bible actually teaches that he should go hungry and that no one should step in and feed him and solve his problem, because he has the means to solve his own problem and should, and as an adult needs to. That's a responsibility. And the same way with the women. The women who get pregnant and they have children, and now they have to raise children and they're dependent on SNAP, they need to say to themselves, hey, I can't continue to be irresponsible like I am and get pregnant out of wedlock, and then expect the government to feed my babies and children and myself, because that is a dead-end road in life. That is basically locking them into poverty for the rest of their life. And if there is some little hiccup or glitch in the system, like what happened in this month in November, then all of a sudden they're in crisis mode. Well, if they have a husband, if they've gotten married and done things the right way and not had sex outside of marriage, but got married first, met a man, got married first, then got pregnant, the man has a job now, he's working, and part of the calling of a man, according to the Bible, is to be a provider. And so the man, that's his job, that's his calling, that's his worry, that's his anxiety. He goes out and makes things happen. It shouldn't be the wife who is trying to raise children and build a family and maintain a home. It shouldn't be her anxiety and burden to try to figure out where the money is going to come from. It's the man's responsibility, and that is part of his unique calling. That's how he's made by God. That he is made to be a provider. He's made to be a problem solver. That's the way it's always been until, recently. That the men, even in colonial times, they would go out and they would hunt in the woods and bring home the meat. And the women would cook that up and feed it to the family. And they would go out and plant the crops and work in the fields and harvest the crops, and then bring home the food for the woman to cook and provide for the children, and so on and so forth. There's order, there's structure into that, and that's what the Bible teaches. But today, everything's all turned up chaotic, And now you have women getting pregnant before they're married. They're trying to raise children. They find out the government will feed them and clothe them and house them and provide for them. And so they essentially make the government their husband. That is not according to God's will. And then when there's some glitch, there's hiccup in the system, like the food stamps are temporarily delayed, all of a sudden they're in a panic mode. And they're screaming and they're hollering and they're crying and I have babies to feed. Well, yes, you do. But the reason why you're in a crisis now is because you didn't do things according to God's will. So we need to teach people the will of God for marriage and family and children. We need to teach it from the churches. We need to teach it in public and society. We need to get back to a Christian understanding of marriage and family and bring this into common knowledge in the culture like it used to be. You know, for most of the United States history, the basic worldview was Judeo-Christian, and people got the message and learned and were educated under a Christian, more or less Christian worldview, so that when they thought about these things like marriage, they automatically thought, oh, I'm supposed to get married before I get pregnant. I mean, that's a basic fundamental truth. I mean, that's what everybody knew before. But now it's pretty much not something that everybody knows, that they're supposed to get married before they're pregnant. And so now that you have all these single mothers who are raising kids without a man in the house, without a provider. And yeah, there's a crisis. And there will be more of these kinds of crises unless we are able to teach people the proper order for marriage and family and child rearing and relationships, and how men are responsible and their roles in the relationship with a woman, and how they're the provider. They're to go out and make things happen. They're supposed to be out there scratching and clawing and bringing home the resources to provide for the wife and children. And it works so much better that way. And yeah, they come home and they're tired, these men, and they come home and they're battered and bruised because it's a cold, cruel world out there. But it's better that they go out there and fight the battles and bring home the resources to provide for the family than the wife trying to go out there and getting battered and bruised. And then she is not made for that psychological warfare and the rough and tumble world outside the home. She's made for the more domestic work that God has designed her to do. And so it works out better that the man go out there and bring home the resources, and then the wife distributes those resources, buys the food or fixes the food and provides for the children and is there for training. And that's the way it works. But because our society is all turned upside down these days and the Judeo-Christian worldview is being trampled upon, and even churches aren't teaching these basic truths, we are in the problem we're in today. So let's pray that we see a spiritual revival in the truths of God's word, and that people understand that there is order, there is peace, there is wisdom in the will of God, and we need to return to that will of God. Well, I hope that's been helpful. We'll see you back next week on another program. God bless.